Good morning, namaskar. It's good to see you again. I'm pleasantly surprised to see you still upright after 4 days of this. As I did with the last session when I was here a couple of days ago, let me touch upon the reading list that I had given you. And I want to add something to that. There's a book that I had wanted to list and it inadvertently didn't get listed. You might want to note it down. It's called JFK's Forgotten Crisis, Tibet, the CIA, and the Sino-Indian War by Bruce Riedel. He's a well-known policy wonk in the US, and I think this is very relevant to the topic that we are going to be discussing today. The 4 books that I had listed, in case you don't have the list with you, I'll just quickly go over it, is the first one is I deliberately put in a rather provocative book, a new one that's, I think, worth reading. It's called No-Go Zones, How Sharia Law is Coming to a Neighborhood Near You by a British-American journalist called Rahim Kassam. The second one is a book I'm currently reading called The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg is a veteran defense and strategy person in the US. He was the one who leaked the Pentagon Papers in the early 70s relating to the Vietnam War. The Doomsday Machine is about how the nuclear doctrines evolved right from the beginning in the early 40s till now. 2 other books are about politics. They are about US politics, but I think they are very, very relevant to a discussion of India-US relations because Indian politics is rapidly adapting to technology using social media. And the techniques that you see in US elections are now very rapidly being emulated in Indian elections. So these 2 books are about the 2008 and the 2012 US elections, where President Obama won both times. One is called Game Change by John Heilemann and Mark Halperin. And the second one is, again, a sequel to that book called Double Down, Game Change 2012, again by John Heilemann and Mark Halperin. Those of you who have a deeper interest in India-US relations, I would urge you to take a look at these books. Now, the US and India have been described as natural allies. This description first came under Prime Minister Vajpayee almost 2 decades ago. And in some ways, they are. They are the world's 2 largest democracies. One is considered the oldest and one is considered the largest. I spent many years in the US as a student and as a young professional, and people of my generation could never understand the tensions and the hostilities that the Cold War had imposed on India-US relations. Because in personal terms, in people-to-people contact, in the large number of students going there, in the Indian diaspora growing very significantly in the US and succeeding, all of this was contrary to what was actually happening in geopolitical terms between the US and India. But that is how things do indeed play out, not always by intent, but by circumstances. In geopolitics, as you are well aware, friendships will change. Nothing is permanent except national interest. And so national interest has kept veering from one set of circumstances to another. In the Cold War, India found itself on the side across the line from the US for a variety of good reasons. In fact, I would even add one more book to your reading list called The Blood Telegram by Archer. And this was about the Bangladesh revolution, and again, where India and US almost faced off against each other. But there are many other books that show a great fundamental affinity between the US and India, even from many decades ago. Even when Eisenhower and Nehru were in office, even when Kennedy and Nehru were in office, the aid programs of the 60s, which actually bailed us out of a critical situation when India was on the verge of a a food crisis. And then with US having a special relationship with Pakistan in our part of the region, particularly from the late 80s when we had immense problems continuing till today of terrorism, which is cross-border terrorism, supported by state units, supported by both overt and covert state units. And the US was often not seen to be on India's side because of its own strategic concerns. That impression still is widely prevalent in India, that the US has not been on India's side. But the reality has changed very dramatically, particularly over the last 2 decades. So what has happened in the last 2 decades, and I can speak with a lot of personal experience from the last 18 years that I've been in Parliament. I have been involved in a lot of foreign policy events, such as this, for instance, but many track 2 dialogues. And in particular with the US, I have been engaged in track 2 dialogues since 2002, that's 16 years. And I'm also involved in track 2 dialogues with Japan, with South Korea, with Singapore, with Australia, and a trilateral with US, Japan, and India. And what has happened in these 2 decades, through several administrations on both sides, is a dramatic turnaround in the relationship. So take, for example, starting with Bill Clinton's last years, after the sanctions were lifted. So India went nuclear in 1998, sanctions were imposed on India. But in those last 2 years of the Clinton presidency, a turnaround started. So that was helmed by President Clinton and Prime Minister Vajpayee. It got taken to another level by Prime Minister Vajpayee and the new President George Bush Jr. That's when the natural allies phrase first came into vogue. Then it got taken to an even higher level a little more than a decade ago when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and George Bush signed the civil nuclear deal, which brought India in out of the cold. This is a very important moment. I'll come back to it in a bit. And then through the Obama and Manmohan Singh years and the Obama and Modi years, there was steady, if not dramatic. May I request you to put your phones on silent, please? So during the Obama and Modi and Manmohan Singh years, there was steady further improvement of the relationship. And there was a lot of apprehension as to what would happen with the Trump-Modi situation, because Mr. Trump was not a known entity in politics. His views were often quite radical. And normally when politicians come into head of government position, they have teams in place that have been working for some years or some months with specific foreign policy positions which were not really there. But as it has turned out, the Trump-Modi relationship is taking the India-US relationship into yet another higher level of closeness. I will talk about that in a minute. This doesn't mean there aren't problems. There are areas where we don't agree, and Mr. Ashok Malik will touch more upon them. But I would like to point out the civil nuclear deal was an inflection point, starting in 2005 and taking a couple of years to happen. Because here were 2 large democracies who did not understand how each other worked. The US was used to dealing with countries, both democracies and non-democracies, where if you make a deal with the head of government, then that's all you needed to worry about. They didn't have to worry about convincing large numbers of people, such as members of parliament, such as editors, such as citizens, activists. But in India, they found it remarkably difficult because India was very similar to what the US has to do. The US can't just impose policies. They have to carry the House, they have to carry the Senate, they have to carry opinion makers. And India was very similar to that, and it became a challenge. Similarly, India also was used to dealing with the executive branch of the US government and was not used to, for example, lobbying on Capitol Hill. Even today, it is considered that India's strength in the US is relationship with key major national figures, but not necessarily on the Hill, although that has improved dramatically over the past 2 decades. So the civil nuclear deal was, I can tell you, I was deeply involved behind the scenes in track 2, and in Parliament I was the only opposition member at that time who spoke in support of it in 2005. It was resisted in the US by their establishment, including the so-called non-proliferation ayatollahs. These were policy wonks who had stints in State Department, at the Pentagon, at think tanks, who had been, their views had been cut and dried from the 70s onwards, when we had been on opposite sides of the Cold War. Similarly, in India, to get many people on board was proving quite challenging. That's why it took a long time. It's very interesting because in our somewhat Gandhian fervor in the 50s and 60s, we took many idealistic stands which, in the cold, harsh light of second guessing, turns out that was not necessarily in national interest. So we did not push our nuclear program at all. We had a hello birds, hello flowers kind of approach. Even when it came to Security Council membership, where there was a possibility that India could have asserted its position as the big Asian giant on the UNSC rather than China. But we took a stand which, in retrospect, many feel was not in Indian national interest. So on nuclear doctrine, because of our feet dragging, a line in the sand was drawn in the mid-60s when the major 5 nuclear powers created what is the nuclear club, and the non-proliferation regime came in, that others were not accepted as nuclear regimes. So either you had to abide to not have your own nuclear technology program, and you could get nuclear power plants set up by technology transfer from US or Russia or China, or you would be an outcast. And ironically, India was treated as an outcast. India's fuel supply for Tarapur and other places were stopped, even though we had agreements, because we did our test at Pokhran in 1974. The crux of this was an irony that the world's largest democracy was not part of the nuclear group. And the bigger irony was that many proliferators were getting a free ride. Proliferators like North Korea, like Pakistan, like China. Whereas India was scrupulous about 2 things. In principle, not signing the non-proliferation treaty on principle, because neither would the US sign it, and our idea was that you can't discriminate, and we can be relied upon to be responsible. And if you don't accept that we can be relied upon to be responsible as a democracy, then we don't buy that regime. But even though we did not sign the non-proliferation treaty and many of the other treaties at that point, India was scrupulously non-proliferating. In fact, India was only the second country after the US that had ever actually taken action to stop proliferation by third parties. There was a Korean vessel that was intercepted carrying illegal nuclear components, which, apart from the US and India, nobody else has ever really done that, intercepted and stopped proliferation. So with the civil nuclear deal, the turnaround happened that a special excuse was given to India, and it took a while to get all the other nations on board, because they had an opposition that if India can be given a free pass, why not South Africa, why not Brazil, why not other countries that might want to go nuclear? But it took a lot of selling jointly for that to happen. And it took a while, and still things are being implemented. We have become a signatory to MTCR, for example, Missile Technology Control Regime, and other aspects. We still aren't a part of the nuclear supply group. This is being stymied by China, and China also, at the very end, tried to stymie our civil nuclear deal with the US. Now, the civil nuclear deal has led to It has not led to a huge number of nuclear power plants coming up, as had been expected, because there are issues concerning liability and all that. But what it did was dramatically change the trust angle between these two largest democracies. So the coming together has continued rapidly apace. There has been dramatic developments on other fronts in terms of technology transfer. The US has started opening up its restrictive technologies to US use. The US has started investing heavily, US companies have, and also European and other companies. India has become a favored destination with, I think now it's being rated as the 5th most favored destination for investment in the world, having just overtaken Japan. In this space of the last 20 years, we started seeing eye to eye with the US in areas where we had had diametrically different viewpoints. So I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. From having totally diametric viewpoints on almost all South Asian countries, we gradually started having the same viewpoint regarding Nepal. There was a revolution underway in Nepal 10 years ago, and the US and India worked closely together, because by that time we had already had 10 years of this coming together. There was a terrorism problem from both our western and eastern fronts. We saw dramatic improvement on the eastern front, where the US and India again cooperated very closely. And to the credit of Bangladesh, the Bangladesh leadership also started deciding that the kind of jihadi terrorism that the subcontinent was facing would doom it, and it started taking a viewpoint that it is not in their interest to provide sanctuary to terrorists who from their land would hit across to India. So dramatic improvement there. The end of the civil war in Sri Lanka saw a very close cooperation between the US and India. All this in the last decade, with another previous decade of coming together first. One holdout was Myanmar, where India had taken a very pragmatic position and the US had a very remote idealistic position. But with recent change in having an elected government in place there over the last few years, again, India and the US have come quite a lot closer together. On Pakistan was the last holdout. As I had mentioned to you in the previous session that I was here, Pakistan had superbly leveraged its geographic location as controlling access to Afghanistan to keep itself relevant at a level far higher than its weight class, if you will. And it still tries to do that. There are other books I could recommend to you to understand Pakistan, especially anything by Hussein Haqqani, a former Pakistani ambassador who writes very bluntly, would be very good reading for you. But lately, even that has started changing. It started changing again about 15 years ago with a phrase that you may have often heard called dehyphenation. Dehyphenation essentially meant that the US prism for South Asia used to be that you cannot talk about India without talking about Pakistan. They were seen as regional powers to be balanced against each other. But starting at the turn of the century, the US took a viewpoint, and this is a viewpoint that had already been asserted by our leaders, such as Mr. Advani and Vajpayee in the late 90s, that we have a different relationship with US and we have a different relationship with Pakistan. We don't need to expect that just because we are friends with the US, we'll necessarily agree with everything. And that if we have slightly or even substantially different views about Pakistan, we can live with it. We will deal with Pakistan ourselves. We will have a different relationship with the US. And this was mirrored by the US dehyphenation philosophy from the early 2000s. This has gradually transitioned to India, and India being seen as far more important to the US, not just as a, it's no longer a balance for Pakistan. If anything, it is now being seen as a balance for China in US eyes and in the eyes of the rest of the world. The climax of this is only recently, when you must have heard President Trump's announcement of a stoppage of $2 billion of aid to Pakistan. This was very much in the news. I don't think I need to go into it. But essentially, starting from about 10 years ago, various American policymakers, such as Joint Chief of Staff General Mullen, Admiral Mullen, various other Pentagon luminaries and now President Trump have been calling out Pakistan for its what they call perfidy or treachery, because Pakistan is now viewed as having a role in giving sanctuary to certain homegrown terrorists, which are the ones which are killing Americans today, and also which are attacking India across the border. I want to conclude my talk by mentioning a little bit about China. This can't not be mentioned. At the earlier session that I was here 2 days ago, I told you about how I experienced China had all these supporters among corporates, among policy wonks, because of their more open market policies over the previous 3 decades. And as that has started changing, as I've explained to you. I first noticed this change about 10 years ago also, when for the previous 5-7 years, I had been hearing that, oh, India is full of red tape, it's not worth getting into India, it's too much of a hassle, you can't make commitments, you can't live up to policy decisions, and China could. But then many American businesses started experiencing troubles in China, where their copyrights were infringed, where they'd have a partnership with a Chinese company, and very soon the Chinese company would start another venture, basically stealing their patents and competing with them. I started hearing this around 2005. And of course, subsequently, in geopolitical terms, China has been stepping on the toes of many of its neighbors, and it has been creating increasing panic. Now, one of the things I kept hearing through these last 15, 18 years in track twos in Southeast Asia and the Far East is, why isn't India stepping up to its own potential? And that has finally started happening. Efforts had been there for 20 years, the Look East policy, the Act East policy, but in the last 3 years, the gears have been shifted rapidly to top gear. This Prime Minister has turned out to be a foreign policy Prime Minister, spending enormous resources, bandwidth, energy, time in going around the world and building relationships. And you can see the result of that wherever I go in the last couple of years, not just in South Asia, Southeast Asia, around the world. There is a new appreciation of India finally emerging as an economic power and able to stand up and take collective decisions in a non-threatening manner to maintain a rules-based world, to have the freedom of the sea lanes, and to have, our mindset has shifted in India from being one of the have-nots to being one of the haves. We've signed the MTCR, as I told you. We have signed something called LEMOA with the US, and we are trying to get into the NSG. And of course, we have aspirations to be either part of the Security Council or to have reform of the United Nations. So this has led to immense development of trade between particularly democracies around the world. So if you look at US and India, India and Japan, India and Australia, India and South Korea, again, enormous coming closer together. Not that there aren't problems, but there are. But despite that, it's more like 3 steps forward, 1 step back, as opposed to an earlier scenario of 1 step forward, 1 step back. So a large number of joint military exercises are now happening. Malabar, for instance. And by the way, the military exercises in which either naval or other kind of military exercises in which the US and India participate are now the largest between India and any other country. So that should give you an idea about where the relationship has reached. Final thing is, in the last 3 or 4 years, there is a shift in the international dialogue in the US and in other democratic countries. Till 3 or 4 years ago, a key part of the dialogue used to be, look, our relationship with India or with any other country is not about containing China. We are happy with the rise of China. We want to engage with it and make sure it is a rules-based player. But in the last 3 years or so, there is a clear, and I'm speaking under sort of Chatham House rules. There is a clear, blunt talk that China is abusing its economic power by defying many of the rules, by defying international arbitration rulings, by imposing its own set of world order, certainly in the Indian Ocean area, in the South China Sea area, and in very far parts as well, such as in Africa and other places. And even though it is not explicitly stated, there is an increasingly clear understanding that maybe just inducing China to play nice is not going to be enough. It also has to be, it can't be just carrots, it has to be carrots and stick. And that to make that happen, the democracies, the large economically powerful democracies have to work together. So the obvious ones are, as I mentioned, India, Japan, Australia, and the Quad, that was a dead concept for many years, is again getting revived. I can suggest many books on China which are sort of relevant to US and indirectly relevant to India, but I don't want to give you a reading list that will keep you busy for the next year. But we can talk about it in Q&A and maybe afterwards over coffee. Thank you very much. Namaskar.